Begin by examining the widely discussed phone conversation, as many treat it like a definitive turning point. During America's Independence Day celebrations on July 4th, Donald Trump engaged in roughly 90 minutes of discussion with Vladimir Putin, followed by a distinct conversation with Volodymyr Zelensky, with both exchanges announced using optimistic diplomatic terminology about willingness to facilitate peace and end hostilities. Yet within 48 hours, Russian strikes bombarded Kiev once more, resulting in over a dozen fatalities and numerous injuries following an even more devastating attack from earlier that week, raising the fundamental question of whether this conflict is genuinely approaching resolution or simply escalating before a major NATO gathering. The truthful assessment recognizes both dynamics occurring simultaneously, requiring careful separation of verified information from preferred narratives. Moscow's official account through aide Yuri Ushakov characterized the July exchange as productive and businesslike, confirming Trump's expressed interest in helping negotiate an end to hostilities, though this same statement accused Kiev and European supporters of prolonging the conflict through long-range attacks on Russian energy facilities, while Putin reportedly discussed battlefield conditions in terms suggesting Russian forces were advancing confidently and reclaiming territory, language indicating a leader who believes circumstances favor his position rather than one viewing negotiations as urgent. The focal point driving current news coverage involves Kostyantynivka, a town Russia's military leadership claimed to have captured on July 3rd, describing it as a key defensive position within the fortified triangle, including Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, while Zelensky immediately disputed this claim on social platforms and Ukrainian military officials insisted their forces maintained control, with Reuters acknowledging from the ground that neither assertion could be independently confirmed, a situation revealing how both governments possess strong incentives to characterize frontline positions in politically advantageous ways. Kostyantynivka's significance stems from geography rather than symbolism. Positioned at the southern edge of Ukraine's Donbas fortress network, a chain of heavily fortified urban centers Ukraine developed over years into locations where attacking forces suffer gradual attrition for every block, and if it follows the pattern of Avdiivka and Chasiv Yar, which fell after prolonged sieges in recent years, it would expose southern approaches to the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk defensive cluster, representing Ukraine's final major fortified positions in that province, the element deserving greater attention than diplomatic calls because it's the variable actually influencing negotiating leverage rather than merely press statements, since whoever controls territory when talks potentially occur negotiates from the actual frontline position, making momentum equivalent to bargaining power, a pattern consistent with historical precedents from Korea to Vietnam's Paris negotiations. Regarding that momentum, honest assessment reveals a genuinely mixed picture rather than simple Russian advancement. Western military analysts, including the Institute for the Study of War, have challenged Kremlin narratives of accelerating offensive success, arguing Moscow requires such messaging for internal and diplomatic purposes, while tangible evidence complicates claims of unstoppable Russian progress, including Ukraine's intensified long-range drone operations against Russian petroleum infrastructure in recent weeks, striking refineries, storage facilities, and even a terminal near St. Petersburg, producing actual fuel shortages within Russia and forcing the Kremlin to redirect air defense assets to protect domestic territory, while Ukrainian and some Western officials report that Russian territorial advances elsewhere have actually decelerated or reversed in certain southern sectors recently, even as Donetsk represents an exception. The aerial situation over Kiev illustrates where human costs become concrete rather than abstract. During July's opening week, Russia struck the capital repeatedly, including attacks Ukrainian authorities characterized among the year's deadliest, followed days later by additional waves killing over a dozen and wounding many more, where interception statistics require careful examination because Ukraine's Air Force reports the overwhelming majority of drones and cruise missiles in these barrages, exceeding 90%, continue being intercepted. But what's deteriorating is ballistic missile interception. Specifically, weaponry only Patriot systems can reliably stop, with Ukraine stating plainly that in some recent attacks, essentially every ballistic missile penetrated defenses. This vulnerability exists due to a mundane structural cause unrelated to negotiating willingness, a worldwide shortage of Patriot interceptors, exacerbated by Israel-Iran conflict diverting deliveries originally designated for Ukraine to the Middle East instead, prompting Ukraine's defense ministry to contact approximately 40 countries requesting temporary interceptor loans from their stockpiles in exchange for future contracted deliveries. Not a narrative about deliberate escalation or maximizing damage before ceasefires, but rather about a specific identifiable weapons constraint both militaries are rationally attempting to exploit or circumvent. Moscow's stated justification for intensified bombardment positions these strikes as retaliation for Ukraine's expanding operations against Russian oil and energy infrastructure, with its defense ministry explicitly warning that additional Western-supplied weapons will trigger correspondingly larger countermeasures. While Ukraine contends that sites Russia claims as targets, weapons factories and drone production facilities, serve as pretexts and actual damage patterns indicate residential structures are being hit, with both claims potentially containing truth simultaneously, since individual strike packages can aim at mixed targets while causing severe civilian harm, regardless of stated intentions, warranting skepticism toward anyone characterizing targeting as either purely precise or purely indiscriminate, since military reporting from both sides possesses obvious incentives to shape narratives favorably, and neither Kremlin assertions about precision strikes on military industrial sites nor Kyiv's claims about deliberate terror bombing should be accepted as straightforwardly accurate without independent verification, which typically isn't available in real time for individual strikes. Regarding diplomacy, it's important to challenge the prevalent framing suggesting we're one conversation away from agreement simply because Trump expresses optimism, remembering this conflict has experienced at least 3 serious junctures where negotiated solutions appeared possible but failed. Istanbul in spring 2022 during the invasion's early weeks, where Russian and Ukrainian negotiators reportedly developed draft frameworks involving Ukrainian neutrality exchanged for security guarantees and Russian withdrawal, a process collapsing amid disputes about what transpired, why it stalled, and how much external pressure from Kyiv's Western supporters influenced outcomes. Disputes different factions still characterize in completely incompatible terms. The Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015 intended to freeze Donbass conflict along ceasefire lines, agreements both sides eventually acknowledged in different ways, and for different reasons they never fully intended implementing as written. And last August's Trump-Putin summit, producing considerable theater and a framework whose details nobody has fully disclosed, which nonetheless momentarily seemed the closest approximation to a genuine off-ramp this war had generated before dissolving in subsequent weeks amid competing domestic pressures in Washington. 3 distinct moments, 3 distinct failures, for 3 sets of reasons that don't reduce neatly to single culprits, the pattern that should inform how much significance anyone assigns to a 90-minute July phone call. What genuinely differs this time and merits serious consideration is timing. This conversation occurred directly before a NATO summit in Ankara scheduled for July 7th and 8th, where Ukraine's air defense deficiencies, alliance defense spending targets, and broader questions about current Western support sustainability are explicitly agenda items, with Zelensky stating intentions to press allies firmly for additional Patriot interceptors, specifically framing it correctly as the single technical remedy that would most immediately reduce civilian casualties in Kyiv, and whether that summit produces new concrete commitments or generates vague communique language, allowing everyone to claim victory while nothing substantive changes, will probably reveal more about this war's near-term trajectory than anything conveyed in a holiday phone call. Is diplomacy genuinely defunct or merely performance? Resisting binary thinking, what appears accurate is Russia currently believes it's prevailing in the specific contest mattering most to its war objectives, Donbas control, and parties believing they're winning possess structurally diminished incentive to offer genuine concessions at negotiating tables regardless of conciliatory diplomatic language. While what also appears accurate is Ukraine's drone campaign against Russian energy infrastructure has provided leverage forms that didn't exist previously, genuine economic damage inside Russia that no volume of battlefield messaging can conceal, and that leverage might ultimately matter more than additional kilometers gained around fortress towns. And what uncomfortably appears accurate is European domestic politics, rather than Washington's disposition or Moscow's messaging, may prove the least predictable variable, with voices across several European capitals viewing this less as a conflict to be settled and more as a confrontation with Russia that shouldn't conclude on terms resembling signaling anything besides clear Moscow defeat. An instinct that, wherever one stands on its justification, leaves minimal space for the messy, compromise-laden settlements actually ending wars in reality rather than policy papers. None of this indicates whether the war concludes this year, next year, or continues grinding the way Minsk did for nearly a decade before entirely collapsing, but it should encourage suspicion toward anyone offering certainty in either direction. Confident assertions that peace is imminent because a president said so during a call, or equally confident claims that Russia's total military superiority renders negotiation futile and collapse inevitable, because battlefield evidence doesn't support either extreme, but rather supports understanding a war fought simultaneously on three fronts rarely discussed together. A grinding urban infantry contest in eastern Donetsk, favoring whichever side can sustain casualties longer. An infrastructure conflict waged with drones and missiles on both nations' territory, inflicting genuine economic and human costs distant from any front line. And diplomatic theater largely for domestic and allied audiences that has thus far generated far more phone conversations than actual enduring agreements. There's a minor linguistic detail easily overlooked, but genuinely worth noting. For years, Russian officials maintained careful discipline, calling this a special military operation rather than war, a distinction sounding bureaucratic, but carrying genuine legal and political significance within Russia, tied to conscription law, wartime censorship provisions, and the domestic narrative the Kremlin promotes about limited surgical action rather than full national war mobilization. So when officials closer to moderate positions within Russia's foreign policy establishment begin slipping and using the word war instead, that's not insignificant, suggesting either loosening message discipline or deliberate signaling that framing itself is shifting, that Moscow may be preparing its population for something with longer horizons and higher stakes than the original operation was marketed as, flagging this as a detail worth monitoring rather than definitive proof, because single-word choices from individual spokespeople aren't policy announcements, but language gets managed carefully in authoritarian systems, specifically because it's rarely accidental. And if that slippage continues rather than getting corrected, it will matter more than most phone call readout content. It's also important being honest about verification limits regarding Russia's military capacity itself, because this represents another area where loudest claims tend to be least verifiable, with Russian officials and state media promoting production figures for advanced systems, hypersonic missiles, and new strike drones in ways clearly intended projecting strength to domestic audiences and Western capitals monitoring NATO spending debates, where some figures may be accurate while others are almost certainly inflated for effect, the same way Ukrainian claims about Russian equipment losses or Russian claims about captured territory sometimes exceed what independent verification can confirm, though what can be stated with greater confidence because it appears in harder economic data rather than press statements is that Russia has reconstructed significant portions of its defense industrial base since 2022, deepened trade and technology relationships with China and other partners to circumvent sanctions, and maintained economic functionality under pressure. Many Western forecasters originally expected would prove far more devastating, though whether that totals a military that in some clear overall sense is stronger than before, the invasion represents a much harder assertion to substantiate than it sounds because it depends entirely on measurement criteria, personnel experience and readiness, equipment stockpiles, technological sophistication or morale, and those four elements currently tell four different narratives within Russian armed forces. Politics on the other side, within NATO itself, deserve equal scrutiny rather than uncritical acceptance just because they represent the more familiar narrative to Western audiences, since the alliance entering Ankara is not a unified entity with singular views on how this should conclude. Washington has been signaling through defense posture reviews that it wants European members shouldering more direct burdens supporting Ukraine going forward. Language about right-sizing America's NATO contribution that reads, depending on interpretation, as either overdue burden sharing or gradual American disengagement. Poland, among the most assertive members on Russia policy since 2022, has reportedly seen portions of its political establishment quietly reassessing that posture's costs as the war extends into a fifth year without resolution in sight. The Baltic states continue advocating harder positions than their population sizes would typically translate into influence, precisely because their geographic exposure to Russia gives their warnings disproportionate moral and strategic weight in alliance debates. None of this tells a story about the West being secretly weak or secretly unified, but rather about an alliance of 32 separate democracies with 32 separate domestic political calendars attempting to maintain common positions on a conflict that has now outlasted multiple election cycles. And that type of coalition strain is exactly the variable that doesn't appear in single phone call readouts, but often ends up determining how these situations actually resolve. If there's one takeaway worth retaining from all this, it's a practice rather than a conclusion. When encountering headlines claiming a city has fallen, question who's making that assertion and in what political context they're saying it. When seeing interception statistics, question specifically which weapon types are being counted, because drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles represent three entirely distinct problems with three entirely distinct solutions. And when hearing that peace is approaching, question what's actually changed on the ground since the last time someone made that claim, rather than focusing on how long the latest phone call lasted. This conflict has generated enormous volumes of confident assertions from people very distant from actual fighting, and the only honest response is patience and willingness to continuously verify claims against whatever confirmable ground truth is actually available. Examining one contested location, one interception rate, one phone call at a time.